Good morning, everybody. My name is Joe Schmidt. I'm the Social Studies Specialist for the Maine Department of Education, and I'd like to welcome you to this professional development opportunity. Today, we are talking about best practices in social studies. This is a two-part series. First part taking place now, second part starting at around 9:30. These will be recorded and posted. The two halves will be posted separately, but in the same place, and you will get a contact hour for participating in this section live. Again, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat box, and I will try to get to them as I can. Where we're going to start in the first half here is we're going to talk about disciplinary literacy and inquiry when it comes to social studies. And what I really want to start with, the common confusion that I get when we talk about disciplinary literacy is it oftentimes gets confused with the idea of content area reading. Disciplinary literacy does not mean reading in social studies. Disciplinary literacy is what it means for how social studies people would read. The idea of disciplinary literacy is, as you see bolded in here, how reading and writing is used in the field, and in this case, in the field of social studies. And this is from Timothy Shanahan in 2012, and you'll hear about him numerous times. So why are we talking about literacy in social studies? The thing is that literacy, what we're trying to do in social studies, is not working. NAEP, the National Literacy Test across the nation, has not seen gains since 1998. So you're seeing 20 years of basically flat growth. We're still seeing the same performance gaps between low-income students, different demographic issues, regardless of what we've done. And if you've paid attention in schools over the past 20 years or so, you know we've put a lot of time, money, effort, and thought into reading. And we're still not able to change these scores. And in the 2018 test results release, the panel of experts at NAEP pointed to part of the problem is that we focus too much on literacy, that by putting social studies and science in the back burner, we've actually done the opposite of what we hoped and intended to do. You can see here Daniel Willingham, who's a psychology professor at the University of Virginia, who talks a lot about reading comprehension, is one of the biggest things that we have to understand when it comes to reading is that we do not, or an author does not put all the information in what they're writing. That would be a long book. You couldn't do it. So what we have to do is writers assume background knowledge of readers. And that's where we're starting to have the problems. Because if readers can't supply the missing information that an author would assume that they would have, then they can't read the text regardless of their reading level. And the example I like to use is if the students don't know who won the Civil War and you give them a reading about Reconstruction, it doesn't matter what their reading level is, they're still going to struggle to read that text because there's going to be so much context built into it. At this point, I know it is 8:08 in the morning, and some of you have had your coffee, maybe some of you have not. I am looking to see for one brave volunteer who's willing to unmute themselves and read the next slide for me. Anybody willing to participate?
I'll do it.
Is it Paul?
Yeah.
All right, and I apologize.
That's me.
I've got a killer guard dog here making sure I'm safe, so.
That's okay.
So Paul, I'm gonna go ahead and click to the next slide, and I'm gonna tell you it's about the montilation of traxoline, okay? And I want you to, I just want you to read the text that's put in front of you, all right? Here we go.
It is very important that you learn about traxoline. Traxoline is a new form of Zyanter. It is montilled in Seristana. The Seristanians gristillate large amounts of Fevon and then bracter it to quasal traxoline. Traxoline may well be one of our most Lucaized Sneslaws in the future because of our Zyanter lescalage.
Awesome, thank you, Paul, for taking that risk. It's not easy. You did very well. Did Paul read, and I won't ask everybody to necessarily chime in, but did Paul read all the words? Paul and the group, do you feel like you learned anything from reading that?
No.
Okay. Are you willing to take a test? And again, Paul, I hate to put you on the spot. This is a little tougher in the virtual environment, but I'm going to give you a little quiz, okay?
I'm ready.
Paul doesn't think he's learned anything, but here you go, Paul. Question number one. Couple reminders. We always have to tell our students, right? Make sure you answer in complete sentences and use your best handwriting, Paul. Otherwise, I'm going to have to turn it right back in. Okay, ready?
Oh boy.
Question number one. What is traxoline?
A new form of Zionter.
All right, you're 1 for 1.
That's okay.
Where is traxoline montilled?
Traxoline is montilled in Seristana.
Thank you. I appreciate the complete sentences. Number 3, how is traxoline quazzled?
Well, that's pretty simple. Let's see. It's quazzled. Where was that? Geez, I'm not sure. I don't think I can answer that one.
I'll give you a hint, Paul.
Where,
the third
where is it?
sentence.
Large amounts for, and then bracteate to quasal traxoline.
So
It's from
how is it quazzled?
Oh, how is it quazzled?
How is it quazzled?
Where? Oh, from Seristanians, gristillate, large amounts of Fevon, and then bracteate to quasal.
All right.
Traxoline.
I was worried there a little bit, Paul, but you're still 3 for 3, so you're doing well. Number 4, why is it important to know about traxoline?
Well, it may be traxoline may be one of our most leucized SNES laws in the future because of our Zionter lessilage.
All right, Paul, you're 4 for 4. I believe that's an A or proficient or whatever scale we're using, 100%. But I thought you said you didn't learn anything when you read the passage.
Oh, you're right. You got me there.
And I'm sorry, Paul, I hate to put you on the spot like that in a group like this. But the idea is we do this all the time with kids. We give them information that they may or may not know anything about, especially our strong students, the ones with strong reading skills and habits. And I'm assuming this room full of educators are people who have those necessary skills. And we pull the pieces together. And then we would finish our unit on traxoline and we would move on to the next piece. And again, I won't just pick on Paul on this, but Paul, I would guess if I called you up tonight or tomorrow or this weekend, you wouldn't remember any of this. But you still scored the A. And this is where we have to wonder exactly how are we approaching kids? What are we having them read? How are we having them engage with the text? And how are we assessing that knowledge? And I can't take credit for this. This is Judith Lanier from the University of Michigan put this together. But I do have one question then for the group, and you guys can go ahead and put this in the chat box. I think I have, oh, okay, hold on. There we go, let me change the setting so that you guys can publicly chat with each other. So my question for you is this. I introed it on purpose to Paul. I said, Paul, I'm gonna give you a reading about the montillation of traxoline. Paul, how did you pronounce the word montillation and how did you pronounce the word traxoline? Do you remember? Oh, you're muted, Paul.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I said montillation and traxoline, I think.
Yep. So what you did is you took any context you could do and you took it over. You heard me use those words, you picked up and you used it again. My question that we'll never know is if I had introduced this as the montillation of traxoline, would Paul have said traxoline? Did Paul really even know how to pronounce the words other than just the context clues that I provided him with? And we don't know. I mean, you could possibly test it with 2 classes of kids, right? Have one kid read it out, say montillation of traxoline, traxoline. But that idea is that we do this with kids all the time. We give them information and we don't necessarily know the background knowledge, and we don't even know, because if we assess them in this manner, they're still able to pass the test. Paul says he read it, didn't know anything, took the quiz, didn't learn anything, isn't going to know it. Yet in the grade book, Paul's a 4 out of 4. And one of the reasons I bring this up is this is a poster from the Council of Chief State School Officers. This is the national organization of like state superintendents, like Commissioner Macon. And they have a social studies group, this SASE for social studies. And in this group a couple years ago, I was very privileged to be, and there were 6 of us who spent a year. We pulled all this information and data together to create this one info chart about the marginalization of social studies. And this was really a focus in elementary school, but it is still part of a bigger picture. And one of the things that we did emphasize is, if you look in the upper right-hand corner, that it is about reading. And if you want students to be better readers, if you want them to score better on reading tests, then they have to give access to social studies and science and the other parts. And you see in the bottom right-hand corner, where is the time being spent in those subject areas? And you see on that left-hand side, the time that we're spending in elementary school is on English, because we're trying to raise reading scores, but none of the research says this is how you raise reading scores. The problem is, it makes sense to attack things this way. Are there anybody in the room who's a sports person or a sports coach that would like to unmute themselves and answer a couple questions for me?
I can, if you want me to.
Who's speaking? I got to figure out who unmuted.
Shane.
Shane. Okay. Where are you, Shane? I'm sorry, I don't have my full grid up.
I'm sitting in my classroom in Sanford, Maine, all by myself.
Okay, there you go. It moved you up to the top. Okay. Thank you, Shane. What sport do you coach, Shane?
I'm the high school baseball coach.
High school baseball coach. Okay. I'm your shortstop, and I'm struggling to field a ground ball cleanly, make the transition, and throw to first.
Sounds about right.
Okay. How would you get me better? How would I get better at this? What would you have me do?
Well, you break it down to fundamentals. You go back to basics. You go over form, technique. You then would have them practice that. You'd hit them ground balls. You'd work on glove side, backhand side, whatever the problem is. But you'd start at the bottom and work your way up, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
And I heard in their practice. So let's say I say, Coach, but I've been practicing 30 minutes a day. How do I get better? What might you suggest?
Either practice better or practice more.
Okay. And maybe even both, right? We'd want quality practice. What's the old saying? Practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect.
Correct.
Right? And we do this in all factors of our life. If we're not good at something, we just do it more. We practice it more. We get those basics, like Shane said, those fundamentals. And if a half an hour isn't enough, then we do it for an hour. And if an hour isn't enough, then we do it more, right? If we want to be good at things. The problem is, the research doesn't show that this works in reading. You can't just read more. And what we've done is the idea of just reading more, especially in elementary school, we've had to cut other time. So we have double literacy blocks. We have different sets that people buy and they use and they implement. But if you look here in 2004, Robert Marzano did research, and he identified what he thought were the 7,923 words a student would need in order to be academically successful in their K-12 career. If you break down these words by the grade bands and then content area, you see highlighted in green are the social studies area. So for example, in K through 2, there was 782 words identified. 162 of them would be taught in history, so that's almost 21%. 89 in geography, civics, economics, etc. So if you break it down, 41.556% of the words that kids would need to know to be academically successful in K2 are social studies words. In grades 3-5, it's almost 58%. So what happens, and I'm not here to throw anybody under the bus, I don't want you to talk about what's going on in your building specifically or point anybody out or say anything, but if you think about, as schools have moved towards a double literacy block, or the idea of more reading time and literacy time, it usually comes at the expense of social studies, and that's what we see on this chart again. The amount of time spent on core elementary social studies is under 11%. And so we're taking these words away from kids in an attempt to make them better readers, when the research says in order to read, you need to know these words. Middle school, same thing, 55%, high school, 50, almost 58%. Although as we get into the older grades, we tend to have a little more focus in those separate social studies areas. Where a lot of this starts is in 1981, Tierney and Pearson did a study, and I've given you a hint because I gave you the picture, and I'm not going to read this entire piece, but if you look on the left-hand side there, there's a reading. And they gave this reading to 4th and 5th graders in the United States, which is important, and asked them comprehension knowledge pieces, not what we did with, who is my first? Paul. Not what we gave to Paul, where it was kind of, I could just go back and pull it from the reading, but they gave them different pieces and asked what some of these words meant. And guess what American kids in 4th and 5th grade knew about these words? Any guesses?
Some of the slide is not showing up.
Okay, I just moved. Is it still an issue? I just moved I saw your note.
It's moving the wrong way, I think. Can everybody see it? Maybe it's me.
Barb, you can drag the picture of us over, and then you can see the whole thing at the top, like you would drag a document or something.
You rock. Thank you.
Is everybody else able to see?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I did have the people images when I was trying to talk with Paul and Shane kind of halfway over it, so that may have been blocking it, but hopefully that fixes that. So thank you, Barb. Barb, while you're on, let's add, or no, oh, she's gone back to mute. Would anybody like to guess, what do you think kids were able to do with this reading?
I'll make a stab at the question. I think that the kids were able to identify what the words meant, but they didn't know that it was about a sport that they probably have never heard of, which I assume is cricket.
Your assumption in cricket is correct, and you're pretty close with the piece, right? They were able to read the words, they were able to identify the words, but it wasn't always in the right context. Like the bowlers placed the men in slips and covers. Those have non-cricket meanings, and the kids were able to put some of that context, but it's not the right context for it. So the kids struggled regardless of reading level. And what the big breakthrough was, this was repeated by Recht and Leslie in 1988, but they made one change. They very explicitly brought in kids, they did it with baseball, and they brought in kids who liked baseball and kids who didn't like baseball, and kids who were good readers and kids who were poor readers. And so a kid fell into one of 4 categories. They gave them readings on baseball and then asked them comprehension questions. And what they found out, not surprisingly, is that kids who were strong readers and liked baseball did the best. What was surprising is that kids who liked baseball but were poor readers did better than kids who were strong readers but didn't know about baseball. And what was more important than that is that the difference in, if you look at the variables, the scoring between reading level and knowledge level was the #1 indicator. Not the only indicator, just the #1 indicator. And so from this study in 1988, which has been repeated multiple times and always comes up with the same finding, the #1 indicator in a student's ability to read is background knowledge, not reading level. And so again, children who can read and understand the context of what they're reading are our most successful readers. But a child who's a struggling reader, who's given the opportunity to work with words that they know and in areas that they're interested in, will do better than a good reader who's being forced to read something they don't know anything about. And that's kind of, again, what we saw with Paul, right? You can read all sorts of things, that doesn't mean you understand it. And so I know I have got a lot of high school people in here. So you're like, okay, whatever, Joe, you've been talking about elementary, not my problem. We've yelled at them already before, they're not listening. So what do we do? But the thing is, it's a high school piece as well, because this is the SAT. And I know there's the idea that social studies is not tested necessarily on SAT, or there is not a social studies component. But if you do look, there's 3 scoring categories on the written part of the SAT. And one of them is analysis. And you see these 4 bullet points here on what students are scored on. Let me try to figure out what the next, okay. Yep. And so in the 3 categories, the highest you can get is an 8. You're gonna score between 2 and 8. You get 2 readers. They will give you a 1, 2, 3, or 4. So if both of them give you the lowest score, you'll get a 2. If they both give you the highest score, you'll get an 8. And so in this section on the main SAT, would anybody like to guess on a scale from 2 to 8 what the average main junior scores? And you can unmute yourself or put it in the chat box. Shane says 5, 4, 6, 5, 4, 4. Unfortunately, no one's hit it yet. 3, Spencer, 2. Oh, Darcy went all the way down to 2. It's a 3. The average score for the reading and writing components is 4 apiece. The average score for analysis is a 3. What does that mean? It means that your average main student has at least one judge, or on average has one judge giving them a 1, the worst possible score. Here's what you need to have in order to score a 1. Little or no analysis, ineffective analysis, without explanation. The analysis is unwarranted. There's little or no support. The support is irrelevant, or there's no discernible analysis. This is the average high school student in Maine has one of their 2 judges telling them this is their writing. And we can talk about all the deep roots about how we got to this point, right? We talked about some of the elementary, we've talked about the approaches, right? But the idea that this reading, writing, this analysis component, well, I mean, there's not that the high school, whatever. This is what it looks like on the SAT, because for me, this is social studies. Did I miss one? This is what we do in social studies. We do analysis of what we read and write. We provide an explanation through the use of evidence and reasoning. We look through a text to provide support, and we analyze the work. Right? In social studies, there's not always that one concrete answer. We want kids to pick a side, develop an argument. And so this is where our kids are at. And I don't want to say that social studies can save the day, but I guess I'll just say social studies can save the day. And I'm not going to show you this video right now, but it will be linked, and I will have this posted, the presentation. I can send it to Barb to make sure that everybody at Sanford gets it, and anybody else who wants it if there's any issues. This is a 30-minute video from Nell Duke from the University of Michigan. I told you about that CCSSO work that we did, and she was involved in that work in developing the infographic, this one. She helped us do a lot of this work around the reading and writing component. And she kept bringing up so many pieces that we asked her if she would do something. And she compiled a 30-minute video of all of the research and data that supports all of this work. And she always says, don't tell my ELA counterparts, but when she talks about like required time for literacy, like a 90-minute block or 45 this, she says there's no research that says any of that supported. Right? And that goes back to when I was talking with Shane around the idea of more practice time doesn't necessarily work. There's no research that supports it. The research that she has, that she works, she's a literacy specialist at the University of Michigan, is all about the background knowledge. And so it's a great video if you want everything all compiled up into that. So if you want kids to be able to read, which I think is a pretty big goal of schools nowadays, then if we do social studies with the proper disciplinary literacy focus, then this is a home run. And I use the word home run because we just talked about a baseball study, and I'm assuming that most of us have the background knowledge to be able to read. See what I did there? I'm going ahead and I'm bringing our background knowledge into making this slide meaningful. I know it's 8:30 a.m., guys. I know you don't want to be here. I get you. I get you. I tried to tell Barb no, but she wouldn't listen. She's a bulldog. Oh, there we go. That's right. All right. So, but okay. So that's that piece, right? Think about that in that context. If I were to say this is a home run and you don't know what a home run is or what baseball, those components, again, this slide doesn't make sense. It's still part of that bigger picture. So what does this look like? What do we do then? Disciplinary literacy and social studies. How many people here are familiar with SHEG, Stanford History Education Group? See some hands going up. Wonderful. Those of you who paid attention or noticed, I know Stanford watched some webinars the other day. I'm not quite sure which ones. I talk about Sam Weinberg a lot. I'm a Weinberg disciple, if you want to call me that. His work goes back to San Francisco in the 90s. And some of the work that they did there around how do you make kids successful readers. And a big part of the focus was the idea of introducing primary sources. And so you see some of his work in here. And they did it for 4 years. And what they found, which was really fascinating, California tested social studies at the time, had a specific social studies test, that high school juniors who took the US history course that Sam Weinberg had created for high schoolers in San Francisco, they scored higher on their social studies test, they scored higher in their reading scores, and not only did they score higher, in a given school year, students should pick up a year of reading level. That's just kind of your baseline data points. Those students in Sam Weinberg's, the classes they worked, picked up just over 2 years of reading level in one school year, which is tough to begin with and really tough in high school. You can oftentimes make up a lot more reading levels in the lower grades, but high school is a little tougher. And so you see a couple of his books there. The first one are on the right, Historical Thinking and Unnatural Acts. The second one I'm going to point out, and you'll see her again here in a second, I'm pretty sure. The Reading Like a Historian. You see Sam Weinberg, Daisy Martin, and Chauncey Montesanto are the 3 founders of SHEG. Sam's the only one that's left there. Chauncey Montesanto's actually left. She's formed a new group at the University of Michigan called Read, Inquire, Write. And she's going to be doing a webinar with us next Tuesday, I believe at 2 o'clock. If you want to learn more about some of the work that she's been doing. She's partnered with a literacy person, and they basically combine the idea of reading in social studies with inquiry to write argumentative writing piece. So she'll be with us next week. The studies, this kind of work's been repeated multiple different ways, and it keeps coming up with the same ones. This is Jeffrey Noakes. He's at BYU, and he did this with 4th and 5th graders. In 2011, he had different groups of teachers working, and he said, okay, the 8 teachers, you're all going to teach this unit on the 20s and 30s. There's 10 lessons in there. But as you work through these lessons, 2 of the teachers only worked with the textbook. They read the textbook, they answered the questions with the textbook and left it at that. 2 of them reread the book with historian strategies. So they went back to the SHEG work and said, okay, how would a historian read this? And they very much read the textbook, but as a historian, looking for sourcing, corroboration, etc. 2 of the teachers took primary sources that were relevant to the 1920s and 30s, and then practiced the historian skills to learn about the 20s and 30s. And then 2 of them took primary sources not even related to the 20s and 30s and just said, we're going to stop learning about the 20s and 30s. We're just going to worry about historical thinking strategies. And you see the key there already if you've been reading head down to the bottom. The ones that just stuck with the textbook, regardless of how they approached the work, didn't have any changes. Reading a textbook with historian strategies didn't make a difference. You had to engage with primary sources, and the 2 groups that engaged with primary sources scored higher on their test about the 20s and 30s. That third group, the one, unsurprisingly, the one that learned about the 20s and 30s with primary sources from the 20s and 30s did score the highest. Not surprising. But here's what we got stuck on, that Noakes got stuck on, that was such an instrumental piece. The fourth group, the one that used their time to worry about historian strategies, but not necessarily the 20s and 30s, they still scored higher. But when they were done with these 4-week units and the teachers went back to teaching the regular way, quote unquote, those students scored higher the entire rest of the year than the rest of the groups. Because they were given strategies that didn't specifically apply to the content, they were able to understand the content, how to apply those strategies to all the content. They learned it as a transferable skill. And so again, both groups scored higher on the content exams, but what was surprising is the group that actually stopped learning about the content for a while scored better the rest of the year. Vince, if you just have to switch who you're chatting to. Yep, so that one did come to me privately. Vince wanted to know if this applies to the use of DBQs, and absolutely. You'll hear a little bit about this more, so I didn't want you to ignore. I didn't want you to think I was ignoring your question, Vince. We'll definitely talk about DBQs with this. Abby Reisman followed up in 2012. She did it with middle school, and just full disclosure, Jeffrey Noakes does not have a connection to Sheg at all at BYU. Abby Reisman does. She was one of Sam Weinberg's PhD students. She did leave and do more work, so just understand some of those biases in research. She did it with middle schoolers. She created 83 document-based lessons, kind of looking at what kind of answers this question here. And over 21 weeks, 5 classes were taught using basically DBQs and 5 were taught the normal way. The ones that use the DBQs, the document-based question groups, they scored higher on the content, they scored higher on historical thinking skills, they scored higher on current events, and they scored higher on general reading, period. So we've seen it at middle. Sam Weinberg started it with high school. We've seen it repeated in upper elementary, and we've seen it repeated in middle school as well. Kids who engage with primary sources as part of their learning and are practicing the skills of a historian of that disciplinary literacy piece score better everywhere. And again, that's why I talked earlier about the disciplinary literacy piece does not mean reading in the content area. Reading a book about a David McCullough book, no matter how thick, or reading even just a Washington speech does not make it disciplinary literacy. When you stop to think and interact of how would a historian do this, and we'll get more about that a little bit, that's where the growth happens. And so I talked about the reading like historian. This is from Stanford. This is one of my favorite pieces. And if we were in person as a full day workshop, I would give you these handouts, and we do it right now. But if you're not familiar with this, I encourage you to check it out. The lunchroom fights. I like part 2. There was a fight in the lunchroom, and there's 10 witnesses or 10 people who give evidence as to what happened. And then you're supposed to decide which of the 2 students to suspend. And it's a great activity with kids. And I have a lot of times working with districts, they assign it out to a grade and say, like, this is one of the ways we're going to start to build across. Paul?
Is that from Stanford History Group?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. I think I've done that. It's great.
And the nice thing is, because they do a really good job of separating out some of those specific skills, because I will tell you, people have approached me and said, well, we're going to do, I remember very clearly, somebody said, we're going to do our SLO, our student learning objective work around a DBQ. And I said, don't, because a DBQ is too thick. So what I advise people to do is break it into chunks. And so, like, if you're doing these big SLO pieces, have your 6th graders work on sourcing a document. Have your 7th graders work on doing a close read of a document. Have your 8th graders contextualize a document. Have your 9th graders, right? You can just, and that's a middle school sequence or high school, break it up, whatever it is, but do, like, my SLO says that students will get better at sourcing documents throughout the course of the year. That's a specific skill that you can break apart. And Sheg does a very nice job of creating lessons that are specific to some of those individual pieces. I'm going to step out of social studies for just a minute. We're going to talk about Timothy Shanahan. He's at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And the last time I checked, I still believe he's the most cited researcher in regards to disciplinary literacy. And he says there's some things we need to talk about when it comes to disciplinary literacy. And I'm going to focus on 3 things. When you get the link here, you'll see that there's 10 more in there. But the ones that I want to focus are, I'll get to here in a second. But what's interesting is that right around the same time that Sam Weinberg was doing some of his first work after San Francisco Public Schools, Timothy Shanahan was doing some similar work. And what they both addressed was they would give people who were mathematicians, people who were scientists, and people who were historians, they would give them readings in their field. And they would watch how they interacted with it. And then they would give students readings and watch how they interacted with it. And what we find is, again, that piece of students don't interact with history text like a historian does. And I'll be able to sprinkle some of those things kind of throughout with that idea. But what Shanahan also said is that social studies is a little bit of a different animal, because even historians aren't convinced. When a scientist does work, they understand like there's a certain process to follow through, right? And I'm always very clear that I understand I'm oversimplifying things, right? In the math world, we give students a math problem, and for the most part, there is a correct answer if you work through the math. If you're doing science experiments in science, right? And the example I always give, like I'm in the presentation, I'm gonna drop my clicker, and it's going to fall to the ground because that's how gravity works. And if it doesn't, then we all need to leave. The session's over, we're going home. But in social studies, it's not that simple. Who fired the first shots of the Boston Massacre? You can make different arguments based on different pieces. I'm going to pause 1 second, just because I think I'm about to get a barking dog because the mailman's driving up. All right, we're good. Not the mailman, the garbage man is what I meant. But the difference between those two is that a historian, what actually Timothy Shanahan's wife, Cynthia Shanahan, also does disciplinary literacy. I love her phrasing. She says we need to accept social studies with a healthy dose of skepticism. And I always emphasize the healthy part, right? We need to not always just take everything for what it's worth. But I think we'll get into more on that a little bit later again. So here's the 3 things Timothy Shanahan talks about. 1, reading has to be a big part of students' disciplinary classes. Lecturing, notes, and PowerPoint presentations are not enough. And I will throw myself on the mercy of this court and be the first one to admit, I say it all the time, I, Joe Schmidt, for 7 years was the world's best awful teacher. I had a PowerPoint presentation for everything. I had lecture notes done out. I had this, I had that, and it was the opposite of what we're supposed to be doing. And it was after my 7th year, I got rid of everything, went to all active learning classrooms. There was no homework. The tests, unit tests were 1 question take home, and I can talk more about that at a different time. But I was that person. And what Shanahan says is you can't just give them the information, they have to read. They have to engage with those primary sources. And if we're talking about elementary grades, you have to read a wide variety of books. And he says, stories are great, but a narrow diet of stories alone can make you sick. Just like anything else, if you eat just the same thing over and over again, you're gonna get sick. And if you have students just reading the same thing over and over again, they're not gonna learn. 2, if students are to read, there needs to be a text, and they need to know the disciplinary literacy approach to it. Really what it comes down to in a lot of this is conflicting evidence. Students have to hear multiple points of view. They have to understand that there's alternative points of view. And this is not to say you can't use a textbook. Some of Jeffrey Noakes' work, he's very adamant. You can use a textbook. A great thing to have students do, according to Jeffrey Noakes, is to read a textbook page or chapter or section and have students write their own. Have them understand how a textbook has to synthesize information down into a couple of paragraphs. That's a skill. Can they take in those pieces? And one of the suggestions I've made, if you don't want to have writing involved, if you're elementary level, you can have them do like a collage. A collage only has so much room, or you can say only so many images. How do you decide what images, what words, what parts to put in? A full and comprehensive US history textbook is going to be, I don't know how many pages long, right? I always say the Civil War by Ken Burns is, I don't know how many hours long, 28,000 hours. I don't know, it's impossibly long. And anytime people tell me they teach the Civil War in a couple of weeks, 2, 3, 4 weeks, I remind them there are entire courses on Gettysburg. Entire semester courses, right? We're skimming the surface, and that's okay. And that's where the textbook has a place. The textbook skims that surface, and do students understand that? And that can be used as bringing part of it in. And so they need to be given those different texts and then understand how to source it, how to work with it, how to take those different pieces. And this last part here, talk about elementary textbooks and trade books. They often just tell the same story. And even our younger students need to be given differing accounts and controversies and allowed to disagree and find the evidence to support what they're trying to say. Disciplinary classes should have a deep dedication to imparting the content to those students and the nature of inquiry. If you know me at all, I love inquiry. I love a good question. One of my hobbies, if someone would pay me full time, I would just sit around and write compelling questions. But that's, if you look at this list of questions, students shouldn't just be given the information and like we did with Paul earlier, right? And said, okay, Paul answered those four questions. He must be good. What we should really do is engage with Paul about the montilation of traxoline. And Paul, what questions would you want to know? How would you approach this? Why did the person say this is going to be one of the most Lukeized Snezzlets of the future? Where are they coming from? Is this a propaganda piece? Is this a lobbyist, right? Like, what are those components? Because that's what we naturally do as adults and as historians, right? We take that little healthy skepticism, and students need to be given that exposure, and that needs to be modeled. And so you see these questions in here. What does it mean to be a historian or a geographer or an economist? What do those people do? What do they read? How do they share the results? Where's the evidence, the criticism? One of my favorite examples I do in here is I like to say I had a class in high school, my geography class. And I will tell you, as a sophomore in high school, we all called it coloring class because we were given maps, black and white outline maps that we would then color. And then we would label. And that was my geography class. And the only thing I remember to this day about being a geographer from that class is that the first thing you do is you find the state or country that touches the most other states or countries. So if Germany is the most and Germany touches 7 other countries, then you need to use at least 8 different colors or you're going to have overlap. That's what I remember. Turns out years later, that's not what a geographer does. They don't color code based on the number of countries something touches. What I really love, if you're not familiar with ArcGIS, I have done some sessions, or somebody did some sessions about some of that. I like some of the work. You look at Florida and give them a map. One of the examples I always use is they get a map of Florida and they say, here's where the population is. Here's where the current highways are. Separate maps. Third map, here's the protected environmental lands. Fourth map, here's where hurricanes have hit in the past, where devastation's been. Fifth map, here's a chart of rush hour traffic times. And then the question is, you get to build one new highway connecting like Tampa to Orlando. Where do you build the road that does not have an impact on the environment? It reduces rush hour traffic. It avoids as many hurricanes, whatever. And you're building out. That's how we use geography. That's how a geographer attacks the world. And so we need to give that with students. Some bullet points here for in elementary. There's kind of some specifics in that. Make sure they're reading all subject areas. Graphics and text and relationship. There was a session a couple weeks back from Dr. Christy Bruger from University of Oklahoma. I like to cite her stuff, so if you want to know more, she did an entire session. The graphics and relationships she's done, her research says that, 70% of the time, the graphic on the page is not related to the text on the page. And so if students either A, can't thoroughly read the text, or B, understand that visual literacy components, they're gonna have a major disconnect if those two pieces aren't always going together. Because if they can only complete half the puzzle, they're just gonna assume the other half goes with it, which isn't always true. Then again, it's about modeling, giving structures, multiple texts, etc. So we talked a little bit at the very beginning about content area literacy, and I said that that's not what we're looking for. We're really looking for disciplinary literacy. So here's what we run into all the time. Content area literacy is still a good piece. It's still a proven practice. You examine what is the same across all or most disciplines, and how do we support it? So I'm thinking for the most part, we have social studies people here in the room. So if you want to give me, I've redone my screen now. I think I can see most of you. You can give me a visual hands up or in the chat box. How many people here have used a KWL before? A what do you want to know? Okay, hands are going up. Some. How many people have ever had students summarize a chapter, or summarize what they've read, or they've previewed a chapter, or you've looked at the table of contents or the book? These are good reading strategies. They're not disciplinary literacy, because those are the type of things you would do in social studies, in science, in math. And the term that Jeffrey Noakes used that I love is, he says, when we do a content area approach, what we're doing is a they say. Content area literacy is reading it, just to read it, or just to be able to read it. And so the they say is when you give students a text, you're asking them, they say. So you tell the students, here's what they say. Now I need you to tell me what they say. You're repeating back with that. And the International Literacy Association says content area literacy is a prescribing of study techniques. And they are still good study techniques. I'm not taking any of that away. They're valuable pieces in social studies, but they're not disciplinary literacy. Disciplinary literacy is about what's different across the disciplines. And I was starting to allude to earlier when we were talking about Timothy Shanahan, those difference in what a historian reads and how students read a social studies text is the missing of this work here. Historians question the author. When was it written? Is there a bias? Who is the audience? Can I find other evidence that says the exact same thing? And that's where that idea of that healthy skepticism comes from. And in one of the pieces, I think it's Shanahan's, but it might be Weinberg, they had a reading from 1870 or 72 that talked about what a horrible president Abraham Lincoln was. Like, okay, well, it was written in the time period, somebody would have experienced that. So what the question boiled down to, what students didn't ask, but historians did, is who wrote it and what was the purpose? And the answer is that it was a KKK recruitment flyer. Does that change that text? Yes. But if a student doesn't ask that question, they're like, oh my God, turns out Abe Lincoln was a terrible president, right? You need to bring those layers in. That's the part that students are missing. And so what Noakes calls this is they say, I say. You give students these pieces of evidence and say, okay, here's what they say. Now tell me what you think about it. So as a student, I look at it and say, wow, they say all of this, and that means I say this. Notice in the other one, it was they say, they say. They say this, I'm going to tell you what they say. In this, I'm going to tell you what I say. People approaching historical texts or social studies texts don't read it as truth, just as an interpretation, right? And I don't want this to just be history. That geography model that I just gave you about Florida, it's just an interpretation. There is not a right answer. If you say, well, we can't go through the Everglades, we have to go here, that's not the specific answer. It's part of that piece. And we're always least sure about the validity. This goes back to the mathematicians, the scientists, and the historians. Historians are always least sure of the validity of their texts. And the International Literacy Association says this is a description of how to use those strategies. These were study techniques. These are strategies to read. So in the end, what I want to focus on, Jeffrey Noakes, he wrote one for history. I tweaked it a little bit for social studies. But you'll notice there's 4 things that a student should do. And I'm going to read this whole thing to you against my better judgment, but I want to be able to emphasize those 4 things. Social studies literacy is the ability to construct meaning with multiple genres. Print, non-print. Kids need to get it all. Political cartoons, maps, charts, words, all of it. They need to critically evaluate text within the context of that work. They can't just take it and say, well, it was said here, so it must be the truth. They have to use it as evidence. Part from here, part from here, part from here. Oftentimes, I'll tell teachers, when students are reading through primary sources and using primary sources, you need to tell them that they need to be able to point at it. If they are using the text as evidence, they should be able to point at that text. And I use the idea of a text can be a picture, a song, a movie, whatever. They need to be able to say, at the 12-minute and 7-second mark, somebody earlier was trying to help Paul, and they said, Paul, 3rd sentence down. Point at it. That's where the evidence comes from. It's not, well, I read all this, but then so the other, yeah, I just feel it's wrong. Where's the evidence? I don't know, I just feel, right? They need to be able to point at it. That's the evidence piece. And then they need to be able to create it. So in the end, if we want them to be historians or geographers or economists, they need to be able to create those things. Create the argument piece. Have them do a mock trial and go through that opening statement like a lawyer would. If that's what you want them to be able to do, they should be able to create those pieces. So quickly, any questions? I realize I slowed down my pace there for a couple minutes, so I'm a little behind schedule, but are there any questions?
I guess I have a general one, Joe.
Sure.
We have a lot of higher level people in our district and in our school that keep reinforcing the belief of in front of everyone that you don't need to learn facts in social studies anymore because you can Google anything. You know, we don't need to memorize countries and wars or anything like that. And I don't think I'm alone in finding that very frustrating because it eliminates context, important context for a lot of people. And I don't know if you've been seeing that or how you approach it, issues like that.
I'm trying to find my book. It should be here. We just had a book study on it yesterday. So Sam Weinberg's latest book is Why Teach History When You Can, thank you, Darcy, there it is. Why Teach History When You Can Look It Up on your phone. Because there is a line. And I will say I'm on the idea that if I have all the time in the world, you get all the content and all the inquiry and all the disciplinary literacy. We don't have all the time in the world. So my basic, if I sum this up, I think to directly answer your question, Paul, one of the things I suggest is, again, I'll go to my Civil War unit because the Civil War is the most commonly taught unit in the United States right now. And I say, how many weeks do you teach the Civil War? Anybody in this room teach the Civil War? Darcy, about 3 to 4 weeks. And I see A. Helmrich, 3 to 4 weeks. My close, 4. I see Kyle Ann, 4. Okay. So it's back to that question, right? You're not teaching the Civil War in 4 weeks. You're teaching parts of the Civil War. And Vince says 3. I'm usually close with that. And so what I challenge people to do, and I did this in the book study yesterday, is sit down, and if you're in the department and you're all teaching the Civil War, what are the things kids have to know about the Civil War? Can you make a list?
Oh, sure.
And are you going to agree on the list? If I said your top 5 or your top 10,
maybe.
Right? I've done it. It's a struggle, you know. And so what I challenge people to do is I'm going to just say, if you have 3 weeks, and I see Karen Stolby, he's done it more, which is good, right? If you're going to go, so Paul, kind of answer your question. Let's just say you teach it, and I'll give you 4 weeks. That's 20 days. You're not covering it all. At some point, you're starting to blur the line between what's absolutely essential and what we think they need, right, in this content, you know. is I say, can you lop off 5 days and still give them the absolute basic content? And then I plug a day in at the beginning around inquiry to give them a question that's meaningful to them. What do you want to learn about the Civil War? Or you pose a really big question to them. Has the Civil War ever ended? And let them grapple with that, to give them a question to hold on to that's meaningful to them. Then you give them that knowledge, that content piece, and in an inquiry arc, which we'll talk about in just a second here, be dimension 2. But then instead of that next battle or general, and again, I'm very, very simplifying things, that last 3-4 days, have them go research their question. Have them come back and do a presentation, a 30-second speech, a poster, a video, whatever. Because in that line, right, they're going to start to do, at some point we drift into, we want every kid to know there was a Civil War and that Abraham Lincoln existed and Gettysburg and probably the Emancipation Proclamation and probably Appomattox Courthouse and Fort Sumter. But you start to lose track somewhere. But if a kid says, I love horses and I want to tell you about the role that horses played in the Civil War, and you let them go answer that question, they will go deep into the Civil War and learn things. I'm a gun guy. I'm going to go learn, did you know about the rifling of barrel? Did it? Great, great, go research it. Come back and tell me at the end. They're going to get that base knowledge. And I won't, Paul, I won't put you on the spot here, so I won't have you ask her. I've asked a ton of times, but one of the questions I always ask, and if anybody wants to try to answer, feel free without Googling it, is how many people were killed at the Battle of Bull Run? Anybody know? Darcy shrugs shoulders. The historians in the room, and again, I'm not trying to put him on the spot, is not an answer. The very first thing somebody should have said to me was, Joe, which Bull Run? Because there's 2. But it's that idea, right? Like, we don't know it. I don't know it. I don't know many of the battles. I probably forget a battle every day, and right, my knowledge keeps going down. But you do need that base content knowledge. And so, Paul, I'll move you on because I will get to
sure,
more into that. But I am in that line of, I think we can move away from some of that content because it is so accessible. And there's, I think I have it in here. If I don't see it in my slides, I will read you this quote at the end. So I like to say questions are the new answers, and look at, when you ask a kid a question, are you looking for the right answer or good thinking? And again, we'll think back to Paul. Paul had all the right answers. We talked about the Marginalization of traxoline. And the example, and I need to make sure I keep on track fast, is I did this with some of my teacher leaders, and one called me back, and we used the Sheg example of what's a better source. A book written in 1999 about the signing of the Declaration, or a Hollywood blockbuster movie made in 2001? And the Sheg answer, the simple answer, is which one? Thumbs up if you think it's the book. Thumbs up if you think it's the movie. Okay. Those who participated, I saw thumbs up for the book, right? Which is this kind of the simple answer, is being more reliable. But instead of, when the teacher asked the student said the movie, but instead of saying wrong, she used my phrase, she said, tell me what? Or tell me more. Not tell me what, tell me more. I'm sorry, I was reading Lauren's. Best for what? Most reliable. Which is the most reliable one? A movie, a Hollywood blockbuster movie, or a book?
Depends on what you're looking for.
Most reliable. Which one's going to be most accurate in telling that story?
But what if you're interested in something that the textbook doesn't cover?
Not a textbook, a book written by a historian about the signing. And again, it's a very simplified piece, right? And in the point, she didn't tell the student wrong. She said, well, tell me more, because that's what I always say when I'm confused. The student said, well, you've taught, or we know that we learn more as time goes on. And you said that the book was written by a historian. A Hollywood blockbuster movie might have multiple historians, and we know that multiple perspectives is good. The answer probably still isn't necessarily correct, but the student showed an understanding of thinking, right? That brought them to a certain answer. And I'd say, okay, if they're understanding that we learn more through time and multiple perspectives is good, I mean, those are helpful things to know. It wasn't about that right answer. And so I just alluded to the inquiry arc, the C3 framework, on dimension 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the dimension 1 is about that questioning component, but dimension 2 still is those tools and concepts. You still have to learn those chunks before you go evaluate your information and then take informed action and communicate a conclusion. Because if you look into here, there is those pieces, right? If you're talking about history, you need to look at change, continuity, and context, etc. Civics, you still need to know the political institutions. The inquiry arc does not say those parts aren't in there or they're not essential. They're just saying they're not the end all be all. There's a real focus on the question. And I always highlight this piece for my elementary people, because when talking about the developing of question, it doesn't say that young kids can't do it. It just says that they'll need support in order to do it. Because I think if anybody's been with young kids or has young kids, you know kids will ask you a million questions. Kids are good at questions. We just need to support them in helping them ask the appropriate questions or the guiding questions to work through that piece. And so again, you'll have these different links. I'm not going to go through all of this now, but the inquiry design model is something now that NCSS and C3 is working towards. They've got a website, they've got a template, there's research. I like to go in, I've done a little summary. The research is like a 30-page white paper that I've boiled it down to 10 bullet points. And I really like to highlight some of those because it talks about it's an active piece. The student is engaged. It's still a standards-based piece that still has to be led by a teacher. You don't just say, okay, go ask a question, I'll see you in 4 weeks. The 3 books that I like to focus on is A More Beautiful Question, which is actually now outdated because he now has a newer book that I just finished reading, More Beautiful Question for the Classroom. Make Just One Change. They do the question formulation technique, and they did a webinar with us a couple weeks back. And then Now That's a Good Question by Eric Francis, which talks about rigor of different questions. But in his original book, A More Beautiful Question, Warren Berger says, knowledge is having the right answer. Intelligence is asking the right question. And he talks about how he got into this piece. His first book is about business. And the realization that he came to is that people who've changed the world, especially in the business world, thought outside of the box by asking questions that people hadn't asked before. That's it. What if we did this? And some of the models he likes to talk about is Netflix. Before Netflix was streaming everything, then remember, we're so dated, we're so old now. How did Netflix start? What did you do with Netflix? Anybody remember, want to share? Spencer, go.
They did DVDs in the mail.
And what was different about Netflix than Blockbuster Video?
That you could do it. You could search the categories from home, I suppose.
You could do that. Yep.
No return date.
No return date.
Time.
No return date.
Oh, I forgot about that.
You paid your subscription, and if you held your movie for a month, they didn't charge you extra. And in the interviews, that was the question. The guy who started Netflix asked the question of, if I've paid to rent the movie, why do I have to pay extra to keep it? Was his founding question. The people who started B&B, the Airbnb service, wanted to know, if I had a futon, I think this is the exact quote, since I had a futon here in my room, in my place, why did my friends have to go stay at a hotel? They just thought differently. And what I love in his latest book that he's now written for classrooms, and I won't read this, but I'm gonna give you just a second to kind of read this piece, because I love this last part. Right now, knowledge is, I'll just read the whole thing, I shouldn't, but I go. If we think of questions and answers as stocks on the market, we could say that in this current environment, questions are rising in value while answers are declining. Right now, knowledge is a commodity. Known answers are everywhere and easily accessible. And because we're drowning in all of this data, the value of explicit information is dropping. The real value is what you can do with that knowledge in pursuit of a query. Back to Paul's question. Is explicit information worthless? No. The key is becoming, what can you do with that? Because it used to be, right, the idea of Encyclopedia Britannica or the expert in the room who could speak to it. And now it seems like it fails just about every time. Let me see what setting my phone is on so my phone doesn't pick it up. But knowledge at this point has turned to as simple as this. Hey Google, what is the elevation of Lima, Peru?
About 505 feet. On the website tripsavvy.com, they say, Lima, for example, is about 505 feet above sea level at the Plaza de Armas, while Cerro San Cristobal rises up to 1,312 feet.
And I don't know if you could hear all that, but the answer is 555 feet at a high point of 1,000, right? We used to have to call somebody or hope somebody knew that answer or go get the encyclopedia. That doesn't mean that information is useless, because we need that knowledge in pursuit of the inquiry. We need that knowledge to support the question, to know what the evidence we're going to look for is. It's not independent from each other. So an inquiry arc does both. And I had mentioned Make Just One Change, this book around the question formulation technique. What you're doing is you're having students come up with their own questions. So what I like to suggest to people is, if you say, okay, my big question for our unit now in the Civil War is, has the Civil War ever come to an end? And we're going to spend our next 3 to 4 weeks or 8 weeks or 10 weeks, Karen said 6 to 10. We're going to answer that question. I love those really big questions, right? But on day one, what I might do is have kids do a question formulation technique about the Civil War. And I want them to come up with a question. So as I'm teaching them about the Civil War, Barb's got a question, Paul's got a question, Dave's got a question, Tammy's got a question, Pamela's got a question. That keeps you rooted and interested. Because if you give them the question, if you can write those compelling questions either with them or for them, or they have their own, this is what brings kids in. And I always say I have to shout it because there's an exclamation point, but compelling questions are provocative, engaging, and worth spending time on. Students care about them. Yesterday, Diana Hess led a session, Dr. Diana Hess from the University of Wisconsin, about, she's the author of, I have these two here because I held Controversy in the Classroom and the Political Classroom. And she talks about how to address these type of controversial questions. But she says, these are the ones that motivate kids. The ethical dilemmas. Can a war ever be won? Right? We can have a victor, but can you really ever win? Right? Have kids handle, and kids will get invested. And if you allow them their space, again, to be, I love horses, I love guns, to look at it through that lens, I promise you they will be all in. And I apologize for those who've heard some of these stories 6 or 7 times, but some of them are just the best examples. And one of them is, I was doing this training with a district, and I kind of got to the point about letting kids ask a question, and they all looked at one of the teachers and they said, dirt bikes. And I said, what does that mean? And the guy said, oh, we've got a kid coming up. He will only read dirt bike magazines. He doesn't do anything else. And I said, okay. And they said, if we let him answer his own questions, he will write about dirt bikes every time. I said, okay, what's the problem? Well, we can't let him write about dirt bikes every time, can we? And I said, if you don't let him write about dirt bikes, what is he going to do? Nothing. He doesn't do his homework. I'm like, okay, so let's have him start by writing. And so a year later, I saw that same group, and I was like, tell me about, like, I'm curious, what happened with Dirt Bike Kid? And it was the best story ever. They compete in Model UN, like the big regional one down in Boston. And they went down there, and this kid had been through the year, right? Writing about dirt bikes. And he was assigned to a sub-Saharan African country. He was on the transportation committee, and they said in front of the entire group, he gave a rousing speech about why everybody in sub-Saharan Africa should be given a dirt bike because of women's health issues, safety issues, access to medicine, access to clean water, access to trade, food, firewood. But because they let him talk about dirt bikes, he learned the other things that went with it. I can't promise or guarantee that, but I think if they'd said no more dirt bikes back in October, I don't think he gives that speech. Right? You find the way. Let the kids learn where they're at. And so this is, I'm not going to walk through this. I just want you to see the question formulation technique. It's about, there's 3 parts that Rothstein and Santana talk about. There's only 3 ways you can think. You can think divergently, convergently, and meta-consciously. And they're all in this piece. Because step 1 is write down as many questions as you can. That's divergent thinking, brainstorming. Every option's on the table. Categorize your questions. Is this open or close-ended? What are you trying to get at with this? That's a metacognitive approach. What was I thinking when I thought of this question? Where am I going? What's the point of this question? Then pick your top 3. That's convergent thinking. Starting to narrow down. Why did you choose them? Which one's the best? You're back to a metacognitive approach to it. And I love, because this is the only way we can think. And the example I give, and I know people haven't been out much lately, but how many people have ever been in a group and you had to decide where you're going to go out for supper that night? Right? What's the first? Hey, we should go for supper. Where do you want to go? What's step 1 when you say, where do you want to go? Everybody starts listing examples, right? We can go here, we can go here, we can go here, we can go here. Then eventually somebody introduces the meta. Yeah, but I don't feel comfortable spending a lot of money. I had Italian last night. I really feel like pizza. So then what do? Divergent. Well, can't go there, then can't go there. Well, Melanie wants pizza and Shane doesn't want to spend a lot of money, so looks like we're going to Subway, or right? That's how we look at a car. And I love this. So always, I think my favorite example. When you go to buy a car, what's the first thing you do? It's the first thing I do. You look at all the cars that are out there, right? You're like, oh man, new car. And then at some point you're like, oh, that's right, I'm a teacher. So I have a budget. I live in Maine. It should be 4-wheel drive. I have a long drive. It should get good gas mileage, right? Meta. Well, then we start narrowing. This is how we engage in our world. And if you want to know more about the question formulation technique, again, there's an entire webinar about that. But it takes you through those thinking processes, and it gives kids questions. And you're looking for compelling questions. Those are the big unanswerable ones that are doing the supporting ones. Because I think, again, Paul, your question, to me, the supporting questions is where the content comes from. And my example that I always use is I helped a teacher write a 4th grade first quarter unit. And the question was, how do people adapt? Okay, big compelling question. Week by week, we wrote supporting questions. How did the Wabanaki adapt over the course of a year? Right, so as a calendar. How did the Wabanaki adapt over the climate change in 12,000 years in Maine? How did the people in Europe who felt that they were being treated unfairly adapt? They came here. How did the people who came to the New World adapt? How did the Wabanaki and the settlers, how did the Native Americans here and the settlers adapt to each other? How did the colonists adapt to changing rules from England? And then in the end, how did the colonists adapt when they felt they were being treated unfairly? Because when they were in Europe, they left. When they were here, they rebelled. But that checked off the content pieces. Those supporting questions propelled the inquiry forward to help us construct our explanation. My argument, how do people adapt? People adapt by, and then the explanation is built off of, by moving, by rebelling, by eating different things over the course of the year, by building different houses, by whatever. They answer the question with the information they gain from those supporting questions. Again, Right Question Institute, the founders, the Make Just One Change, it's not just social studies. You see all these subject areas, these are just a screenshot. Paul, again, I hate to pick on you, but your question, right? They do have a webinar asking questions in the age of Google, because it is still about that inquiry piece, even when you have access to all the information. Examples of compelling questions that I use and share the idea that it's not specific to a grade level or a content. There's elementary, there's middle school, there's high school, there's economics, civics, right? These are big questions that will set you up for a unit. Go ask kids, do we have to have rules? What is the greatest cost of water? I mean, I love these. I helped somebody, we did, was the French Revolution successful? And then what you get into, well, the questions are like, does it have to be successful for everybody, right? That's where it starts to split off. Could a kid argue that the French Revolution was successful because it benefited a small group of people? Sure. But I think we turned this into, was the French Revolution revolutionary? Because this teacher, I remember saying, here's my problem with the French Revolution. We start over here with the king, we have all this stuff, and then we get to Napoleon. Did anything change? How can a revolution be a revolution if nothing changes? Which was a brilliant question, right? So then we started to, how do you define a revolution? Does a revolution have to change, right? And so students were then engaging in those different types of pieces as they were walking through that knowledge of the content of the French Revolution. Managed to catch up there a little bit. What questions do you have about inquiry in social studies? And I won't put you on the spot because I'm not going anywhere.
No, I'll ask one.
Sure.
If you're just beginning to incorporate inquiry into your curriculum, let's say for semester-long courses at the high school level, where do you start? What should we be trying to achieve?
The advice I've given multiple times is start small and be okay with failure, steal from others, and start with your worst. So when I do the all-day inquiry workshops, I ask anybody, so when I do this question formulation technique, I ask, what is the one unit that you get done every time and you're kind of like, ugh, I need to change that for next year? Start with that one. Write a question for that one unit. Because I've been in districts. When I was in Wisconsin, I got to do consulting work, and I remember being in a district. I did this whole workshop. It was a department of 18 social studies people at the high school. And somebody got done, they're like, you really expect us to do 18 two-week inquiries? We're going to rechange? And I said, no, just start with one. I'm not asking you to start everything all over. Start with one. You'll like it, it'll work, right? If you're doing as a team, maybe you want to tackle a couple, right? I don't suggest you all of a sudden say, well, it's June 4th, by September 1st, I hope you have a completely redone curriculum. Start with a unit, start with that question. And again, I suggest, like, what's the one you're not happy with anyway? Just go with there. If you've got a great unit, don't be like, well, Joe said we have to do inquiry, so. Now, if your idea is, well, I've always done it this way, so I don't want to change, that's way different than I have something that's successful. Stick with what's successful. Find a way to bring in the inquiry. The places that you don't feel you're successful, really try to retool around that arc. And so I will say, so if end of the day is 68, this is session number 65 that I've given, or that's been hosted since the end of March. So they're all on this page. And so there is sessions on there about disciplinary literacy. There's sessions around inquiry. There's sessions about the question formulation technique if you want to go deeper on any of those. But I think for right now, I will take this break to load this one. Does everybody here who wants to attend the next session, does everybody here have the link to that next session? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay, I'm gonna close this one out. So this recording can start to process. I will show up on that other one in just a couple minutes. Hold on, I have to figure out where all my buttons are. There we go.